A man only stepped into the temple to fulfill a routine. Yet in that moment, the door of the unseen realm opened, and what he witnessed has left its mark on the soul of humanity until this very day. I see that scene as if it is unfolding before my eyes. The throne shining beyond imagination, the hem of the robe filling the space, smoke rising, the stone foundations trembling, and around him the fiery beings lifting their voices with the triple cry of holy, each echo piercing through the air and weighing down upon the heart of mortals. In that light, Isaiah uttered the cry of a soul laid bare, "Woe is me! I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Almighty." I understand what he felt, for when the soul confronts absolute holiness, every veil of disguise is torn apart, and the earthly self has nowhere to hide. But it was not for destruction, but for cleansing. A seraph came carrying a burning coal from the altar, touched Isaiah's lips and declared, "Your guilt is taken away, your sin is atoned for." I know that image is not just an ancient story. It is an eternal symbol. The fire from the altar is a painful yet healing experience, a radical conversion where words that once could be filthy become instruments of truth. Then the voice resounded, "Whom shall I send and who will go for us?" And from a trembling heart, Isaiah burst forth with an uncalculated reply, "Here am I. Send me." I realize this is the rhythm of every soul, broken before the light, then lifted up to be a bearer of the message. Fear transformed into readiness, seen into mission. When I reread this passage in visions, I see it not merely as the personal story of one prophet, but as a pattern for all generations. For each person at some moment steps into the unseen temple within, faces holiness, hears the call, and must answer. I see in spiritual memory that Isaiah did not choose this moment. He was led to it as a student, is led to the final lesson, and what happened engraved upon his heart that he belonged to a mission greater than himself. I clearly understand his trembling, for when my soul is called to read the unseen records of others, I too feel the same weight, that I am small, unworthy, yet at the same time propelled to labor for the light. Here there is no coincidence. The smoke, the trembling, the angels, all are signs that the veil between the visible and the invisible was drawn back to show humanity a principle, that the Holy One is not distant. He steps into the very center of religion, transforming it from ritual into encounter. I believe the image of the burning coal touching the lips is symbolic language for the trial that every soul must pass through without preparation, without merit, only grace and the decision to surrender. Once the coal touches the lips, the person no longer lives for themselves, but becomes an instrument. And from then on, their words carry the power of creation or judgment according to the will of the one who sends. From my perspective, when Isaiah said, "Here am I," it was not a sudden courage, but an echo of destiny. His soul had been prepared through many lifetimes to utter that response. And when the lips were cleansed, the answer was awakened from the depths. This shows me a law that when a person truly faces the light, the only response of worth is readiness, not demanding details, not requiring guarantees, only the naked answer, "Here am I, send me." This opening story lays the foundation for the entire mission of Isaiah, a book containing both judgment and hope, both warning and comfort. And it all began from one moment of encounter in the temple when I close my eyes and imagine again. I do not only see Isaiah, but I also see everyone who is reading these lines. For every soul has a temple, each has a burning coal. Each will hear the question, "Who will go?" And if you feel your heart trembling, that may be the very call meant for you, the call to step out of meaninglessness and become a messenger in your own time. I see Isaiah not merely as a solitary figure in history, but as a soul placed at the exact intersection of upheaval and destiny. He was born into a noble family in Jerusalem, witnessed and directly participated in the crucial events of the kingdom of Judah. From the long stability under Uzziah, through the years of Jotham, then the calculating reign of Ahaz, and Hezekiah with his moments of revival, he did not only observe, but absorbed each shift, as though positioned at the very center to serve as a channel for the message of heaven. I see Judah's context then like a nation walking on the edge of a cliff. Outside stood the vast Assyria with its fearsome armies, Babylon rising, Egypt scheming, while inside faith was wavering. Kings and leaders sought solutions and treaties and diplomatic power, while neglecting the one who had created them. The tension was not only political, but also spiritual. The temple still crowded, yet hearts far away. Rituals maintained, yet souls empty. In that chaos, Isaiah was called to become an uncompromising voice. And as I read, I sensed clearly that he did not choose this calling. Holiness itself chose him, a man who could not escape the responsibility to speak truth, though he knew that truth would bring opposition and even hatred. I see him standing as a witness in the sole record of a nation. His words, both are sword-cutting illusions and a stream promising renewal, and each reign he lived through carried a lesson. Uzziah died. Long stability vanished, and that was when the vision came in the temple. Jotham reigned in uncertainty. Ahaz turned his back on warnings and sought refuge in Assyria, while Hezekiah had moments of return to faith. And in each season, Isaiah's voice would not be silenced. I know that in the cosmic record, at great turning points, there always arise people with the right frequency to serve as conduits. They are like pillars keeping the flow from collapsing entirely. Isaiah was one of them. And what is remarkable is that he did not only speak to his own people, but also to the mighty empires around, as though his mission was not limited by national borders, but open to all humanity, declaring that every power is subject to the authority of the Holy One. I see clearly in his work a twofold rhythm: judgment and hope, warning and comfort, and that rhythm is not by chance, but by law. For judgment is never apart from the ultimate aim of healing, and hope never appears unless first there is confrontation with painful truth. Whether Isaiah stood in the palace or on the street, his words carried the same weight, and in his eyes there always shone the vision from the temple. That sight kept him from being swept into political schemes. Unfazed by the might of Assyria or Babylon, he carried the memory that the true throne is not in Nineveh or Babylon, but enthroned in the heavenly temple. I see that this memory was what kept him steadfast, for people easily waver when confronted by swords and treaties, but whoever has seen the glorious throne will never mistake the false for the true. This makes me think of the lesson for today, when humanity too is standing in a modern Judah, surrounded by powers, divided within, and souls easily seek safety in external authority, while what is truly needed is to return to the sacred throne. Once open to Isaiah, I feel that each person carries within a part of Isaiah. That part will speak when circumstances press to the brink, when old supports collapse, and it is precisely in those moments that we will hear the call of heaven, not to flee, but to stand and speak the truth. Isaiah is living witness that a human being can become the mouthpiece of God in the midst of turmoil, and so his story is not only to be retold as past, it is a mirror for the present, a reminder that no empire is eternal apart from holiness, and no treaty is strong enough apart from faith. I see that to understand Isaiah, one must view him not merely as a prophet in history, but as a symbol of the union between history and soul, between political upheaval and spiritual vision. And it is this very union that gave his words the power to surpass millennia and still resound today. The vision in the temple unveiled the absolute truth, the throne of glory shining bright, the seraphim lifting their holy songs that shook the very foundations, the smoke rising high, and the human soul could only cry out, "Woe to me, for I am ruined." It was not the lament of despair, but the only response when standing before holiness, where every disguise falls away, where sin is exposed in its true form. The power of the light does not lie in condemnation, but in unveiling. And this unveiling opens a door to purification. A seraph approached with a burning coal, touched the lips, and the word was spoken that guilt was taken away and iniquity removed. That image is not merely an event of the past, but a principle at work in every soul. That pain and trial may burn fiercely, yet they open the way for transformation. I know well that feeling when the old self is burned away and a new voice is born, where the mouth that once uttered false words becomes a vessel for truth. This is the sacred rhythm, light revealing imperfection, fire purifying defilement, then the question from the throne resounding, who will go for us? This is not a command of compulsion, but an invitation for the soul to step into the orbit of mission. And the answer comes forth at once here, am I, send me? I feel the weight of that moment, where freedom and destiny merge into one, where man no longer has the right to return as before. For the light has reached to the very roots. That statement is not a sudden act of courage, but the fruit of an entire process. Isaiah's soul had been prepared beforehand to speak it, and the burning coal was but the right that awakened that potential. From that moment on, he was no longer the observer of Judah. He became the mouthpiece of God, a witness to holiness among a people sinking into chaos. I realize that it is precisely this contrast that creates the power, for without the immense distance between holiness and sin, there could be no true transformation. And without the violent collision with truth, there could be no complete response to mission. This is the pattern for every age. For every person has an inner temple. Each one will one day hear the question from the throne. And the essential matter is not whether one is perfect, but whether one is ready to say, here am I. When the soul truly hears the call, all calculations instantly lose meaning. Al delay collapses. Only an absolute surrender remains. I understand that holiness does not come to crush humanity. It comes to break the false self, to give birth to the true person. And in that birth is a voice capable of shaking an age. Isaiah passed through fear to become a witness to this principle. And that is why his words still echo today, for in every sentence, the resonance of that temple moment still lives, the resonance of light, of fire. And off the answer here, am I, prayers still rose in the temple, incense still spread, offerings were still brought, but holiness was absent in empty rituals. That was the piercing warning Isaiah received and declared that God does not need ceremonies full of form when the heart has turned away. He said, plainly your hands are full of blood. I do not listen to your prayers. You keep the festivals, yet neglect justice. You sing hymns, yet oppress the weak. I feel the severity in those words, not because God rejects worship, but because he refuses hypocrisy. When faith becomes only a shell to cover injustice, I see more clearly that the law of the soul never accepts division. One cannot both offer sacrifice and oppress the poor. One cannot sing hymns while keeping malice, for holiness requires unity. The mouth and the heart must be one. Ritual and life must be joined. In the sacred record, prayers not born from the heart are like smoke without lift. They vanish into nothing and never reach the throne of glory. And that is the greatest deception. Man thinks he has served, but in truth he only empties his own soul. I see Isaiah as a trumpet, shaking this habit. He stood before a nation rich in ritual but poor in justice, and he declared, "Learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow." That is the worship God accepts. I realize this is not only a word for Judah then, but a law for every age. For even today, people cling easily to form, turning faith into ceremony to soothe themselves, yet the soul withers for lack of justice and mercy. The lesson is that true worship is always measured by concrete action, by how we treat the weak, the voiceless, and every song in the temple is meaningless if outside its gates are injustice and violence. I know this way of life is hard to accept, for it forces man to remove the mask. But there is no other path. If worship has no justice, then faith is only a dead form. Isaiah became the wake-up call for the whole nation, that ritual cannot save the soul. Only real inner change can return them to covenant. I realize that these words still echo for the world today, where religion sometimes turns into outward symbol, lacking inner transformation, where people easily find comfort in ceremonies, yet stay indifferent to injustice. And so we too hear the same warning again. Stop the meaningless rituals and return to essence, which is faithfulness, righteousness, and mercy. In this contrast, I see a sharp principle that God never allows hypocrisy to endure for long. He will expose it. He will make empty rituals become heavy, so that man must awaken. And I understand that it is precisely in the collision between ritual and justice that Isaiah laid the foundation for a new vision, that true faith is not found in the quantity of offerings, but in a life that reflects holiness. And once the soul receives this principle, worship is no longer form, but becomes a complete life. In the days of Isaiah, Judah continually placed its hope in political alliances rather than holding to the covenant. The kings ran after Egypt or Assyria as if horses and treaties could protect them from destruction. But the sacred voice rang out through Isaiah, warning that those who rely on human strength will fall. Those who trust in war chariots and mighty armies will become nothing. But those who place their trust in the Holy One will stand firm when everything else is shaken. I read those words again and see clearly the law of the soul, that safety never comes from the outside, but from the inner root. And when that root is not planted in holiness, every alliance is only a fragile shell. Isaiah told King Ahaz, "If you do not stand firm in faith, you will not stand at all." Those words were not only for one dynasty, but for every age. For man still often deceives himself that foreign power, wealth, or political strategy can replace faith. In the sacred record, every misplaced alliance becomes a chain, for instead of delivering, it draws the soul away from the source of life, and the result is always disappointment, loss, and collapse. I sense Isaiah's firmness as he stood before the court, before men who calculated every move, and he repeated the unchanging principle: do not place your hope in the flesh, return to the Creator, for only He preserves destiny. He did not speak to please, but to unveil the truth, and because of this he was regarded as unrealistic, yet his words were the only truth. I understand that the images of chariots and horsemen Isaiah used are not merely military background, but metaphors for all human reliance on external forces, and they are warnings for us today. For though this age no longer depends on Egypt or Assyria, men still lean on modern Babylons, on wealth, technology, or political power, as if these were firm foundations. But the truth does not change. Any support not from the Holy One will break when trials come. I see in this law of balance a paradox, that when man abandons faith to cling to human strength, that very strength becomes the cause of his downfall. But when he forsakes chariots and returns to faith, it is in weakness itself that he finds safety This was the lesson Judah paid for, and it is also a mirror for those living now. For any soul that chooses the wrong support binds itself to ruin. Isaiah made clear that salvation does not come from contracts, not from diplomatic treaties, but from placing full trust in the one who called them his holy people. And once this is forgotten, every scheme becomes a snare set for themselves. I perceive that this warning is not only for an ancient nation, but for every soul. For each person faces the choice either to trust the shell of personal power or to trust in holiness. And only one of these paths leads to stability. This lesson is inscribed in the sacred record that every misplaced alliance leaves consequences, yet grace remains open if man will turn back. And therefore, Isaiah did not only condemn, but also called out, return, trust the Redeemer, stand firm in faith so that you may stand firm in life. Babylon, proud with its massive walls, Assyria, cruel with its iron armies, Moab, smug in arrogance, Egypt, radiant in past glory, all are brought before the throne of God, and every pinnacle of power is laid low, showing that no kingdom escapes the law of justice. Isaiah's voice thundered, Babylon will fall, Assyria will be broken, Moab will wail, Egypt will tremble. And in each pronouncement I hear the unchanging principle that pride swells only to be deflated. Thrones built on arrogance become ashes. When I read again, I see not only political prophecy, but the law of the soul at work. Any power, whether empire or individual, that lifts itself against the Creator has collapse awaiting as only a matter of time. Babylon shone like the jewel of the world, but that brilliance was full of pride. They believed that strength and wealth made them invincible, but Isaiah foresaw the day that city became a haunt for wild beasts. Music silenced, glory turned to desolation. Assyria was called the rod of wrath, allowed to be an instrument of judgment. Yet when they arrogantly claimed mastery of that power, the law of balance fell swiftly, and they too were humiliated, as they had humiliated others. Moab was mentioned not only in grief, but in the prophet's tear. For even when their arrogance led to ruin, there remained a reminder that the mercy of the Holy One is never completely withdrawn. Egypt, the name that once made Israel tremble with its history of slavery and towering pyramids, also could not escape judgment. Yet even in shaking, there was a promise that one day Egypt, together with Israel and Assyria, would become a blessing to the world. I see that in every judgment there is a crack of hope, for the purpose of judgment is not to destroy forever, but to humble pride and open the way for restoration. Even when Babylon fell, a seed was preserved. Even when Assyria collapsed, a promise for the remnant remained. Even when Moab crumbled, there was still room for mercy. And even when Egypt trembled, there was still an invitation to reconciliation. This shows me that justice and mercy are never separated. Judgment and hope always walk together. For if judgment stood alone, mankind would be annihilated. And if mercy stood alone, justice would be trampled. But when both operate, the soul is stripped of pride to bear new fruit. I see that this message is not only for ancient empires, but resounds for every nation and every age. For any society that grows arrogant, that makes power and wealth its idols, its downfall is assured. And any individual who builds life on pride and ambition will be brought low to learn humility. The nations before the throne of God are mirrors of every soul before holiness. Every Babel in the heart, every Assyria in the will, every Moab in self-satisfaction, every Egypt in pride of the past, all will be balanced. And only when the soul bows before truth can new shoots rise from the fragments. This makes me understand that no kingdom is an exception, no life is exempt. Every throne built on self-exaltation will shake, and only a foundation planted in holiness can stand. Isaiah shows me a vision broader than politics. It is both judgment and promise. That judgment comes to overturn falsehood, and hope comes to build a lasting future. And this law is for all ages, for empires, and for each soul alike. Outer Babylon and inner Babylon is not merely a lesson in history, but a revelation of the soul, because Babylon did not fall only as a city crushed by foreign armies. It fell as a mirror, exposing the pride of humanity itself. The prophet Isaiah described it with terrifying precision, a place once filled with music and laughter, suddenly reduced to silence, where idols of gold and silver lay shattered on the ground. And that image is not confined to the Chronicles of Kings, but stretches forward to every age, declaring that any tower built on human arrogance must eventually collapse. The ancient empire that exalted itself as eternal proved itself fragile, because no strength, no wealth, no alliance can hold up when it seeks to rise above the Creator. This is the principle written into the very structure of existence, that what is built on pride will be brought down, and what is raised on humility will endure. I see this principle not only in the ruins of Outer Babylon, but also in the secret life of the heart. For there exists an inner Babylon that is no less real than the city itself. And it is here that the battle becomes personal. Inner Babylon is that subtle voice that whispers invincibility, the craving that builds identity on possessions, the confidence that trusts in intellect rather than wisdom, the ambition that exalts self over the one who gave breath. And though it is invisible, it is more dangerous than armies and walls, because it enslaves from within. Isaiah does not simply speak of judgment as annihilation, but as liberation. For when the rod of the oppressor is broken, the oppressed rise in freedom. And so too, when the inner towers of pride collapse, the soul is released into a new kind of life. Judgment then is not only destruction, it is a tearing down that makes room for renewal, a collapse that opens the way for true foundations, a silence that prepares for new music. I have seen in my own journey how certain towers rise silently, towers of reputation, towers of possessions, towers of intellect, and they seem unshakable until life itself delivers a blow that brings them to the ground. And though painful, in that fall I discover freedom, for the soul was never meant to be chained to those things. The piercing question remains for each of us: what tower of pride within must be brought down? And if we refuse to answer willingly, then time and circumstance will answer for us, often in storms and upheavals that strip away what we clung to most. Babylon in Scripture is always more than a city. It is a symbol of the arrogance of man, the hidden rebellion that lifts itself higher than God, the ambition that dresses itself in strength, but is hollow at the core. And that is why its fall is inevitable. Yet even here, hope is not extinguished, because every fall creates the possibility of a new rising. Every collapse clears space for a better foundation. Every ruin becomes the soil where humility can grow. The task then for every generation is to recognize the Babylon within before it is forced down, to humble oneself before being humbled, to learn through surrender rather than through collapse. Because transformation that comes by choice is gentle, while transformation that comes by disaster is sharp and merciless. When Isaiah paints Babylon's fall, he is not indulging in history. He is holding a mirror before us. And in that reflection, the soul sees its own structures of pride. Outer Babylon was a city of walls, gates, armies, treasures, temples, but inner Babylon is built of more subtle stones. The desire to control, the hunger for recognition, the refusal to trust, the secret exaltation of self, both crumble in the end, because both stand in opposition to the true order of creation, where only God is eternal and all else is dust. The lesson becomes clear. Outer Babylon warns us of what happens to nations that exalt themselves Inner Babylon warns us of what happens to souls that refuse humility, and in both the collapse is certain, but in both a seed of hope waits beneath the ashes. For the Lord who breaks the oppressor's rod also plants the tree of freedom. The God who brings down towers also raises up the humble. The judge who declares ruin also whispers redemption. To see Babylon rightly is therefore to see not only judgment but grace. Because the tearing down is not the end, it is the beginning of something truer. I hold this lesson as a call to vigilance. For Babylon rise quietly. It hides itself in successes, in pleasures, in strength, and only the discerning heart can detect it before it grows tall. To confess the Babylon within is the first act of resistance. To humble oneself before God is the first step of freedom. To surrender ambition into his hands is the way to avoid collapse. For the truth, Isaiah shows, is that history is never distant. It is the theater of the soul. And what is written about kings and empires is at the same time written about the private life of each person. Babylon out there and Babylon within are inseparable mirrors, one revealing the other, one reminding the other, and in both the end is the same, that pride must fall, that idols must shatter, that the false music must be silenced. So a new song can begin. The only question is whether we will watch our towers fall in ruin or willingly lay them down to build on humility. And in that choice lies the difference between destruction and renewal, between exile and homecoming, between the silence of ashes and the song of freedom. Emmanuel, the sign God is with us, is not merely a verse from prophecy, but the axis upon which the entire hope of humanity turns. Because when Ahaz trembled under the weight of hostile armies, he sought rescue in the power of Assyria, trusting in human alliances rather than in the covenant of the Lord. And in that very moment, the prophetic word broke into history, declaring that the Lord himself would give a sign: a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel, which means God is with us. Not a shield of iron, not a parade of soldiers, not the noise of cavalry, but a child. And this was the reversal of every logic man had ever known. Because kings expect treaties, nations expect warriors, but heaven answered with the fragile cry of an infant. This is the scandal and the mystery of divine presence, that the Almighty does not reveal himself in spectacles of force, but in nearness, in a presence so intimate that it unsettles the arrogant, yet comforts the weak. When Ahaz longed for visible protection, the sign was invisible to reason but undeniable to faith. For the promise of Emmanuel revealed that salvation would not come from far-off solutions, but from the very presence of God, entering history itself. This is not only a message for a wavering king, but a proclamation for every soul in crisis. Because Emmanuel is the answer to fear in every generation. The reminder that God does not stand at a distance calculating from above, but comes down to walk beside us. I see this truth unfold with profound clarity, that when man looks for deliverance in strategies and power, God answers with companionship. When man seeks to build defenses of stone, God brings the softness of a child, and in that apparent weakness is hidden the deepest strength of all, because true power is not domination but presence. The titles that Isaiah sang over the child were not ornamental phrases, but living truths: wonderful counselor to guide the confused, mighty God to defend the weak, everlasting Father to embrace the abandoned, Prince of Peace to still the chaos of nations and hearts. And each name is like a doorway into the mystery of divinity clothed in humanity. Emmanuel is not an idea. He is the reality of God choosing to be here, not above, not apart, but here. And this reality is what every trembling soul must grasp, that the universe is not empty, that the Creator has not withdrawn, that in the very midst of threat and despair, he is near. I realize that this nearness is not sentimental language, but the essence of redemption itself, because salvation is not God sending help from afar, but God himself stepping into the dust of human struggle, breathing our air, carrying our burdens, and even tasting our death. This is the paradox, that divinity does not despise humanity, but enters it, takes it on, sanctifies it from within, and by that very act turns weakness into strength and fear into faith. For Ahaz, the prophecy was a rebuke, an invitation to trust that was rejected, but for us it is a promise fulfilled, a reminder written across centuries that Emmanuel is not just then, but always, that in every darkness his presence remains. When the enemies of life surround, when uncertainty steals sleep, when the soul feels abandoned, the sign is the same, not the sudden removal of trouble, but the certain presence of God with us in it. I understand now that the humility of this sign is what makes it so powerful, because what needs to prove itself by might is insecure, but what comes in silence and stillness carries an authority beyond question. Emmanuel shows that strength is not in crushing opposition, but in standing alongside the broken, not in intimidating fear, but in casting it out by presence, not in staying distant, but in drawing close enough that one can whisper peace into the human heart. This is why fear dissolves when Emmanuel is known, because fear thrives on isolation. But when the soul realizes it is not alone, a new courage awakens, not because the battle vanishes, but because companionship transforms the battle itself. I have seen this reality again and again, that when people discover the nearness of God, they endure what once seemed impossible. They sing in prisons, they forgive in suffering, they stand firm though storms rage. And the secret of that resilience is not their own strength, but the presence of Emmanuel. The prophecy, therefore, is not trapped in the scrolls of Isaiah. It reverberates through every age, because the same God who promised then promises now. The same presence that stood as a sign for Ahaz stands as a sign for us, that the Lord does not forsake his people. In every trembling heart, Emmanuel rises again, not as a concept, but as a reality. And to know this is to step into the deepest assurance that no darkness is final, no fear is absolute, no exile is without a companion. The presence of Emmanuel is the foundation upon which faith stands, the reason why the soul can wait when deliverance delays, the reason why peace is possible even in war, the reason why hope survives when everything else collapses. To grasp Emmanuel is to grasp that the ultimate gift of God is not merely something he gives, but himself, with us, within us, beside us. This is the sign that overturns despair, that rewrites history, that changes the cry of abandonment into the song of belonging. And this sign remains the eternal anchor of every soul that dares to believe. The Prince of Peace and the kingdom that does not fade is the vision Isaiah carried like a flame through the long corridors of rejection, because his call was not simply to announce judgment, but to proclaim that beyond the ruins of earthly kingdoms there exists a reign that endures, a kingdom not of violence but of peace, not of shifting thrones but of eternal stability. I see with clarity that Isaiah's loneliness was not an accident. It was the shaping ground where his eyes could look beyond the illusions of Judah's politics and pierce into the horizon of God's plan. And it was there he spoke of a child to be born whose government would have no end, a Prince of Peace who would establish justice forever. This is no ordinary vision, for human history is littered with kingdoms that boast permanence yet fade like smoke. But Isaiah declared one kingdom that will not crumble, one throne that does not depend on armies, one government founded not on power struggles but on righteousness. The paradox here is staggering, because while men built walls, trained soldiers, and formed alliances, the prophet proclaimed peace as the foundation of the truest kingdom. And this peace was not a fragile ceasefire, but a deep reconciliation of man with God, of man with neighbor, and of man within himself. I understand now why the Prince of Peace is central, because without peace, no kingdom lasts. And without true peace, no soul endures. And the peace that Isaiah saw was not man-made treaties, but the presence of the divine king reigning from within. When I meditate on this, I see how every earthly power has its hour and then passes. Babylon fell, Assyria collapsed, Rome crumbled, yet the kingdom Isaiah foresaw has never ceased to spread, because it is not bound to geography, it is not limited to dynasty, it is not maintained by swords, it is written into the very fabric of eternity. The Prince of Peace embodies this reality, for he reigns not by coercion, but by persuasion, not by crushing enemies, but by turning them into brothers, not by demanding tribute, but by giving himself. Isaiah's vision is astonishing in its scope, for he looked through the smoke of war and saw a time when swords would be beaten to plowshares, when nations would no longer learn war, and when the wolf would dwell with the lamb. And this imagery is not naive poetry, but prophetic declaration that the reign of peace is stronger than the cycles of violence that have always defined history. I realized that the loneliness Isaiah endured was the preparation for seeing such things, because one who still craves the applause of the crowd cannot proclaim a kingdom so radically different from the kingdoms of men. Only one stripped of dependence on recognition can dare to describe a throne established by peace. His words carry weight because they were birthed in solitude, hammered on the anvil of rejection, and fired in the furnace of waiting, and thus they stand across the centuries as a witness that what is born in isolation often becomes the food of generations. The kingdom he spoke of does not fade because its foundation is righteousness, and righteousness is not subject to decay. It does not shift with politics. It does not collapse with time. It endures because it flows from the character of God himself. Every other kingdom fades because it is built on pride, greed, violence, or ambition. But the kingdom of the Prince of Peace endures because it is built on truth, justice, mercy, and love. I perceive that this is not only a future hope, but a present reality. For whenever a soul bows to the Prince of Peace, the reign of that kingdom begins within, and each heart that receives it becomes an outpost of eternity. In the midst of time, this is why the kingdom spreads not by conquest, but by transformation, not by borders, but by hearts, not by decrees, but by lives changed. Isaiah's vision, therefore, is not only political, but profoundly personal, because the peace of the Prince is what every restless soul longs for. The kingdom that does not fade is what every weary heart seeks. I recognize in my own life that times of collapse, when external supports fell away, were precisely the moments when I encountered the rule of that eternal kingdom most deeply. For only when the noise of fading thrones dies down can the quiet authority of the Prince be heard. To know his reign is to discover that true security is not found in armies or wealth, but in the unshakable presence of the one who governs forever. This kingdom is invisible to the proud, yet undeniable to the humble, ignored by the powerful, yet embraced by the broken, hidden from the ambitious, yet revealed to those who wait. The Prince of Peace carries no sword, yet his reign outlasts empires. He commands no armies, yet his authority is unchallenged. He builds no palaces, yet his throne is unshaken. And this is the paradox that confounds the logic of the world, yet sustains the hope of the faithful. Isaiah proclaimed it when no one wanted to hear, and yet his voice has outlasted the voices of kings and generals who once silenced him, because truth is always stronger than power, and peace is always stronger than violence. Even if it takes centuries to be revealed, the kingdom that does not fade is therefore not a dream, but the deepest reality the final word over history, and the anchor of every soul that dares to believe, the suffering servant. The mystery of healing is perhaps the most profound vision Isaiah ever carried, for in it the veil of history is torn and the eternal pattern of redemption is revealed. A servant without beauty, without recognition, without honor, yet chosen to bear the weight of humanity's pain. Isaiah described him as despised, rejected, considered worthless, and in that rejection the crowd turned away, believing he was cursed, struck by God, forgotten. But the truth hidden beneath was that he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities, and the punishment that brought us peace fell upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. I perceive here not merely prophecy, but a cosmic law, that sacrifice becomes the conduit through which suffering is transformed into redemption, as if pain, instead of being wasted, is converted into energy that heals others, as if loss itself is rewritten into the language of blessing. The servant does not rescue with sword or throne. He does not break chains by force. He uses his very body as the altar, and in silent endurance he becomes like a lamb led to slaughter, opening not his mouth, and that silence is not weakness, but the supreme strength of one who consents fully to the will of God. The more I read Isaiah's words, the more I sense that every detail is inscribed with terrifying precision, that he would be cut off from the land of the living, laid with the wicked in death, yet buried in the tomb of the rich. And in these paradoxes, a design emerges, so intricate it cannot be human invention, a design written before time into the scroll of eternity. What astonishes me most is that the very one despised becomes the fountain of healing. The one crushed becomes the seed of life. The one condemned carries the guilt of others, and in doing so makes them righteous. And here lies the mystery that confounds reason, yet awakens the soul, that salvation does not come through triumph, but through surrender, not through domination, but through sacrifice. I understand now that Isaiah was not only pointing to a future figure, but also unveiling a principle of existence itself, for every soul that longs for renewal must pass through this path, must die to the old self, must bear the weight of inner suffering, and only then from the ashes can the new creation rise. The servant's path becomes a mirror of every true transformation, where the ego is crushed, yet the spirit expands, where wounds become wells of strength, and where surrender opens the door to victory. In the language of mystics and sages, this is the resonance of sacrifice, that when one willingly suffers for the sake of others, the whole body of humanity is lifted. The vibration of such love becomes a frequency strong enough to liberate even those who do not deserve it. And in that resonance, the world is healed. I see in this truth the end of all illusions about healing, because true healing is never escape. It is never avoidance. It is the alchemy of turning pain into life, of letting suffering pass through the soul until it is transfigured into compassion, forgiveness, and strength. The suffering servant is the eternal witness that within wounds there can flow streams of life. Within agony can rise the seed of renewal. Within death can emerge resurrection. And this is not sentiment, but the deepest mystery of creation. Isaiah gave humanity this vision not only for Israel, but for every nation, every people, every soul. For all carry sickness, all carry pain, all carry the secret guilt of transgressions, and all need the healing that comes not from power, but from sacrifice. I realize now that the servant's image is not simply an event in history, but a principle written into the very fabric of the soul, because every time a person embraces suffering with love instead of bitterness, a fragment of the same mystery unfolds, and healing touches more than one life. To endure injustice in silence, yet transform it into forgiveness, to carry pain, yet release blessing, to be crushed, yet allow compassion to rise, This is to step into the same current. Isaiah saw the current of redemptive suffering that heals. The paradox is that the world despises weakness, yet the servant reveals that weakness surrendered to God becomes the greatest power of all, for through wounds flows a river no enemy can stop. By his stripes we are healed. These words ring not only as a declaration about him, but as a pattern offered to us that when the soul accepts to die with him, it also rises with him. When the heart consents to suffer for love, it also opens the channel of life. This is the mystery of healing that reason cannot fully grasp. Yet the soul recognizes that redemption is born from the very place of rejection, that victory emerges from apparent defeat, that life bursts forth from the tomb. To contemplate the suffering servant is to confront both the depth of human sin and the depth of divine love. For he bore what was ours, he carried what we could not carry, he endured what we deserved, and he gave in return what we could never earn. Isaiah's vision stretches across centuries, but its relevance is immediate because every soul still carries wounds that long for healing. Every life still encounters suffering that seems meaningless, and only by entering this mystery can pain be given purpose. Only by touching this secret can wounds become sources of strength. The servant teaches that to embrace suffering with faith is not to be defeated, but to be transformed. And in that transformation, not only is the individual healed, but others are lifted as well. Because sacrifice is never solitary. It radiates outward like ripples in water. The mystery of healing, therefore, is not escape, but participation in this eternal pattern where suffering is not the end, but the beginning of redemption, where wounds are not shame, but the passage of grace, where death itself is no longer final, but the threshold of life. A tree stump cut down seems dead, the trunk fallen, its branches and leaves burned away. Yet Isaiah affirms that within that stump there remains a holy seed, which is the image of the remnant, the portion preserved by God. It is no coincidence that the vision uses tree and stump, for the life of a nation or a soul may go through times of pruning, cutting, even felling, but the core sown by the covenant is never erased completely. The remnant are not merely survivors of disaster. They are the seed of the future. They carry the will to return. They are the proof that the faithfulness of God is stronger than the rebellion of man. I understand that this principle repeats itself in history many times. A nation may fall into exile. The temple may be destroyed. Collective faith may dry up. But there will always remain a small group who keep the fire, souls who do not bow to idols, people who silently hold on to faith amidst the ashes. They are the testimony of the covenant, and from them God rebuilds. Isaiah shows me that even within judgment, the purpose is not to wipe out, but to purify, and it is through purification that the remnant becomes the essence, like gold refined by fire. This is also a principle for each individual, for in personal life, there are moments when we feel cut off, losing everything, faith shaken, yet within the root, there still remains a holy seed. And if we allow the live coal to touch our lips, that seed will sprout, new life will begin from the place thought dead. I realize that the remnant is not the majority, not the noisy crowd, but the chosen portion, the humble portion, the faithful portion, and their strength does not lie in numbers, but in the quality of their faith. The history of Judah proves that when the whole nation abandoned the covenant, it was through the remnant that the promise remained, through them that the underground stream of grace kept flowing, and through them that the hope of a Messiah was kept alive. I sense that this is a timeless principle. For in any society, no matter how corrupt, there will always remain a remnant, those who preserve the soul, those who stand firm when others collapse, and they are the seedlings of the future. The lesson for each of us is to ask whether within ourselves that remnant still remains, whether that holy seed is being nurtured, or has it been buried under the ashes of pride and despair? For it is precisely that part which decides the future, not what has been broken, not what has been lost, but the seed that remains in the root, which will sprout when the spring of God comes. The remnant is the reminder that God never abandons. He may allow the felling, but he preserves the holy seed so that life may continue. And that seed is the symbol of the eternal covenant, which cannot be erased by failure or exile. Time is always the thin line between collapse and lifting up, between judgment and the chance of rebirth. And Isaiah shows clearly that all things unfold according to a rhythm set by God, not by the haste of man. When King Uzziah died, all Judah fell into unrest. They sought treaties, sought support from foreign nations, but in that very moment, a great vision opened to Isaiah, as if to prove that when man thinks he has lost his footing, God is still on the throne. I understand that waiting for the right time is a difficult lesson, for human nature is always impatient, always wanting results immediately. But the soul matures not by gaining quick outcomes, but by learning steadfastness and silence. The years Judah faced Assyria and Babylon illustrate this vividly. For while the people feared, God still promised that a shoot would spring from the felled stump. A redeemer would come at the appointed time, and that promise was never late and never rushed. I learned from the records of the soul that every trial has its season. No pain is permanent, and no glory endures if it is built on pride. All revolves around the precision of divine timing. When Isaiah said the people must wait, must hold on to faith, he was not calling for passivity. He was calling for endurance. For haste would lead to false treaties, but steadfastness would open the way for grace. I sense more clearly that in personal journeys as well, there are moments when everything seems to collapse. Plans fall apart. Dreams remain unfinished. But it is then that the chance arises to look up and see that the throne remains, that God still holds the entire situation. The lifting up does not come from avoiding ruins, but from learning to stand firm within them, keeping faith that the appointed time will arrive. Isaiah became the witness to a nation that delay is not abandonment, but preparation. And when the season comes, the holy seed in the stump will sprout. The shoot will rise. I know that this lesson is not only for ancient Judah, but for every life, for all will have times of drought, times when prayers seem unanswered. And then the soul must choose either to collapse in despair or to endure in hope. The difference lies in whether one believes that God is still with them, whether one believes that the appointed time will come. I realize that every lifting up comes with a waiting, and it is in that waiting that the soul is trained, for without years of silence, faith would not be strong enough to hold when grace bursts forth. Time is the hidden law in every soul record, and restoration comes only to those who can listen to the rhythm of heaven, who dare to be steadfast when no result is yet seen, and who dare to keep faith in the dark. Isaiah has shown me this through his life and prophecy, and thus I understand that restoration never comes, early or late. It comes at the right time, and the only thing to do is to keep the faith until that moment is revealed. The acceleration in the prophecy of Isaiah is not haste, but the divine rhythm when the word spoken becomes reality, with a speed that no one can stop. For once the appointed time has ripened, the event will erupt like fire spreading in the wind, and no human power or empire can resist it. I realize this is like when a seed quietly germinates underground day after day unnoticed, but at a set moment it breaks through and grows rapidly as if in the blink of an eye. This is exactly how prophecies operate, silently preparing. But when the season comes, it surges with acceleration. In the days of Judah, Political upheavals seemed like mere conflicts between kingdoms, but Isaiah shows that they were the acceleration of the divine plan. Assyria rose, then fell. Babylon grew arrogant, then collapsed, all unfolded as a sequence of acceleration, preparing for the sign of Emmanuel, leading to the day when a shoot would spring from the root of Jesse. I understand that the soul follows the same rhythm. There are periods that seem slow, prayers silent, nothing moving. Yet when the roots have gone deep, the transformation happens so quickly that it overturns the entire life. Like a harvest coming suddenly, divine acceleration has its own nature. It does not need human push. It is not controlled by calculation. It only requires agreement and steadfastness. And once the conditions are met, it bursts forth. Isaiah describes the fall of Babylon like thunder resounding, the appearance of the Redeemer like radiant light. That is the acceleration beyond human control. I see clearly that this also works in each life. When transformation comes, it does not arise from gradual accumulation outside, but from hidden preparation within. And once the inside is ready, nothing outside can block it. This is the principle that makes me understand the need to respect the process, for the slowness before is not wasted. It is the foundation for later acceleration, and when the time comes, the result bursts forth a hundredfold. I know many souls grow weary in the silent stage, but if they persist, the day will come when everything shifts swiftly, like Israel in exile, thinking it would last forever. Yet the promise of restoration came suddenly, like the rise of Cyrus, allowing the people to return, all taking place in divine acceleration. This acceleration is also a warning, for sin and pride also accumulate, and when judgment time comes, the collapse strikes with a speed that no one can resist. Babylon lost its place, not gradually, but in a single outburst of wrath. I learned that acceleration has two directions, one of lifting up and one of tearing down, and the outcome depends on the root. The soul has sown. Those who sow faithfulness will see the acceleration of blessing. Those who sow pride will see the acceleration of collapse. This is an unchangeable law, and Isaiah became the interpreter of that law by his own life and prophecy, so that I and every generation may understand that divine acceleration is not chance, but the eruption of what has been sown quietly before. Zion once lay in ruins, its walls collapsed, the temple desolate, songs replaced by weeping, but the prophetic word rang out, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you." I hear that and realize that restoration is not merely rebuilding a city, but a transformation at the root. When what was destroyed becomes the testimony of God's faithfulness, Jerusalem is called by a new name. Its walls will be named salvation. Its gates will be called praise. This image shows that the ruins will no longer be remembered by shame, but renamed with joy. Old pain turned into the doorway for a new presence. I understand that in the law of the soul, this is the principle of rebirth. When a wound is offered to the light, it ceases to be a weakness. It becomes a gateway, and those who walk through will find hope. The restoration of Zion is a symbol for every life, for each person has a place of brokenness, of ashes, of failure, but when placed in the hands of the Holy One, that very place becomes glory, not for boasting, but to prove that light is stronger than darkness. I recall the soul records of people who seemed buried under tragedy, but when they offered their pain to God, that very pain became the source of strength to lift others, just as Zion rose from the ashes to become the gathering point of nations. Kings from afar bring gifts. Peoples stream to its light, not because Jerusalem holds political power, but because it bears the mark of true transformation, and its attraction comes from the glory of God dwelling in the city. I realize that restoration is not simply the return of what was lost, but the raising into something greater than before. For Zion was not merely rebuilt as it was, but clothed with new glory, given a new name, covered by divine presence. This is the law of healing, that what was once considered weakness becomes the strongest testimony of transforming power. When I read these words, I understand that each soul has a Zion within, and when that Zion is given to the light, ashes turn to glory, failure turns to testimony, pain turns into a doorway for others to step into joy. This is not only a promise for an ancient city, but a map for every journey that ruins are not the end, but the beginning of greater glory. Isaiah describes the new heaven and the new earth as a vision, where sorrowful memories lose their power, where tears are silenced and death loses its meaning, where wolves lie beside lambs and children can lead without fear. That image is not only a distant prospect, but the ultimate pattern by which every present action is measured. I understand that when the prophet painted that picture, he was not speaking of a world reachable only at the end. He was placing in each hand a dictionary where every letter is written by acts of righteousness, every line inscribed with mercy, and every page opened by truth. The new heaven and the new earth begin with a seed in the heart, with a small choice, with the decision to forgive when there is reason to resent, with lifting up when it is easier to neglect, with words that build when silence feels safer. I realize that every righteous act is a letter that writes the new sky. And when enough letters are joined, an entire new order is formed, not only at the end of history, but right in the present. Isaiah says that those who sow righteousness will reap peace. Those who keep faithfulness will inherit joy. This is the law of the universe, and also the definition of the new heaven and the new earth. For in it there is no room for injustice or violence, only harmony built by every right choice. I see more clearly that the transformation of the world does not begin with empires or governments, but with the soul of each person. For if there is no new heaven within, the outside will only be the repetition of old Babylon. And if there is no new earth within the heart, the land will still be soaked with blood. The new heaven and the new earth are not for escaping reality, but for shaping it. It is like a blueprint already prepared, and every time people act according to righteousness, they are writing another stroke into that blueprint. I have learned from sacred experience that souls who remain faithful in trials are those opening the doors of the new heaven for the whole community, because the power of a holy act does not stop at the individual level. It spreads and shapes the entire atmosphere around. Isaiah calls it the time when children no longer cry, when life is prolonged, when the fruit of labor is no longer taken away. That image is both a promise and a call, that if we want to see it in the future, we must practice it now. I know that this vision is not a dream, but a certain rhythm. For the same God who turned ruins into glory will make the new heaven and the new earth a reality, and he is inviting each soul to participate through their own choices of living. As I contemplate this, I realize that the new heaven does not fall from above. It rises from the heart, and the new earth does not appear from distant miracles. It is planted from seeds of righteousness each day. This is the ultimate pattern, and every step in faithfulness is a brushstroke that adds color to the eternal painting. Justice as the true form of worship is the theme that burns through Isaiah's words like fire, because again and again he strikes against the illusion that ritual can replace righteousness, that offerings can substitute for obedience, that incense can cover the stench of injustice. The prophet begins with a vision that shatters every complacent heart, declaring that God is weary of sacrifices offered by hands stained with blood, weary of festivals and assemblies that hide corruption, weary of songs sung by lips that oppress the poor. And in that vision, the holy demand becomes clear: to seek justice, to defend the orphan, to plead for the widow. I see with clarity that Isaiah does not despise ritual itself, for worship in its essence is sacred, but he exposes the distortion of worship when it becomes detached from life, when it becomes a performance instead of truth, when it hides injustice instead of revealing holiness. What God desires is not empty form, but integrity, not smoke without substance, but hearts aligned with his character. And his character is justice flowing like a river, and righteousness like an unending stream. This strikes me with piercing force, because it means that the truest offering I can give is not what I place on an altar, but how I treat my neighbor, not the words I recite in prayer, but the way I live in truth and mercy. Justice itself becomes worship, because in defending the oppressed, I mirror the heart of the one I claim to honor. In refusing exploitation, I sing the song of his holiness. In choosing fairness, I lift up an offering more pleasing than 1,000 bulls. Isaiah reveals that every empire, every ritual system, every throne that ignores justice will collapse, because injustice is wrought at the core of any structure, and no amount of religious ceremony can prevent the fall. This is why he denounced Judah even while the temple still stood, because the people trusted in ritual while crushing the poor, and in that blindness they thought they were safe under the shadow of the sanctuary. But the prophet thundered that without justice, the sanctuary itself becomes an abomination. I recognize in this a principle not limited to one nation, for across every age the temptation is the same: to use religion as a shield while ignoring the weightier matters of the law. But Isaiah unmasks this delusion, reminding that worship without justice is not worship at all, but idolatry of form. The true temple is built of actions of mercy. The true incense is compassion rising. The true sacrifice is a heart surrendered to righteousness. And these alone remain when all rituals fade. This convicts me deeply, because it means that my prayers cannot be separated from my life. My songs cannot be detached from my deeds. My worship cannot be confined to sacred hours if injustice fills the rest of my days. Isaiah's message is both sharp and liberating. Sharp because it cuts through hypocrisy, liberating because it lifts worship out of the narrowness of ritual into the vastness of life itself. To practice justice is to walk in continual worship. To treat others with dignity is to lift a constant hymn. To live in fairness is to stand continually before the altar of the Most High. This transforms the meaning of religion, for it is no longer limited to places and times, but becomes the fabric of existence. Every act of honesty, a prayer, every gesture of compassion, a psalm, every step in righteousness, a sacrifice. Isaiah points us to the vision of a kingdom where justice is the very atmosphere, where peace flows because righteousness rules. And he reminds us that this vision begins not in grand ceremonies, but in daily choices, in the humble fidelity of those who refuse corruption and embrace truth. I realize then that justice is not only an ethical demand, but the deepest form of communion with God. For to align with his justice is to align with his nature, to walk in his path, to live in his light. The prophet shows that this alignment is what sustains nations and individuals alike, because when justice is forsaken, collapse is inevitable. But when justice is embraced, stability endures. In this light, I see history differently, not as random chaos, but as the outworking of this principle. Empires rise and fall, not merely by power, but by righteousness or its absence. Lives flourish or wither, not merely by circumstance, but by whether they embody the justice of God. Worship, therefore, is inseparable from ethics, faith inseparable from practice, devotion inseparable from compassion. To separate them is to create a hollow religion, but to unite them is to create a life that becomes a temple. Isaiah's cry still echoes today, challenging every heart, every community, every nation, that without justice worship is void, but with justice even silence becomes praise. This is the secret he unveils, that the truest song of holiness is sung not by choirs, but by lives lived in integrity. The truest incense is the cry of the oppressed lifted and answered. The truest sacrifice is the will surrendered to do good. Justice as the true form of worship is not only a demand, it is also a promise, because in walking this path, one enters the stream of God's own life, and there peace flows, yo endures, and worship becomes endless. The words of comfort in Isaiah do not come as a lullaby, but as a strong wind lifting the fallen soul to rise again. Comfort my people. Their sins have been forgiven. Their punishment has ended, and a way will be opened in the wilderness for the Holy One to return to his people. I understand that true comfort is not to cover the pain, but to bring into the midst of pain a certain promise that what has been ruined will be rebuilt. What seemed lost forever will become a new beginning. The power of this comfort does not lie in empty words, but in the assurance that God still holds authority. He does not forget, does not abandon, and still governs every detail. I hear Isaiah saying that the weak will be strengthened, the weary will be renewed, those who trust in the Lord will soar like eagles, will run and not grow weary, will walk and not faint. This is not a poetic image. This is a sacred law. When the soul puts its hope in its own strength, it will surely be exhausted. But when the burden is given to God, then new energy flows in, not the strength of the flesh, but the strength of the Spirit. I feel more clearly that comfort is not separated from truth, for God does not promise to remove every hardship instantly. Promises endurance. He promises to turn the wilderness into a pathway. He promises to turn burdens into wings. That is why the comfort in Isaiah is not only gentle words, but also lifting up, forcing the listener to raise their head, to look beyond the present, to believe that the picture is larger than what the eyes can see. I know this is a necessary lesson for every soul, for all have moments of weariness, of feeling forgotten in desolation, and it is precisely in that moment, if the heart opens to receive, this source of comfort will be found, a strength from above. The comfort of God does not make people weak, but makes them strong. Does not turn them into dependence, but makes them stand firm. And that is why the words of Isaiah still echo to this day, reminding that when we are exhausted, it is not the end, but the time to surrender to the source of eternal life. The words of Isaiah still echo in my mind like the resonance of a song that does not end, a song both solemn and full of hope. And through each vision, I have learned that history is not only the story of nations past, but also a mirror for my soul. Every warning about Babylon or Assyria is also a warning against the pride within me. Every image of a stump cut down, yet with a holy seed remaining, is also a reminder that even in failure, a life potential still lies hidden. When I think of Emmanuel, I deeply understand that God never stands far away. He steps into history, steps into the frailty of flesh to teach me that nearness is the method of redemption. When I contemplate the suffering servant in Isaiah 53, I cannot escape the truth that true healing is always bound to sacrifice, that wounds are not for hiding, but to become sources of healing for others. I realize that my own journey is also a series of ruins and restorations. There were times I was like Jerusalem burned down, but when I gave the ashes to the light, those very broken places became gates for others to enter into joy. The restoration of Zion reminds me that no wound is useless if it is offered up, and the rebirth of the new heaven and new earth teaches me that every small act of righteousness contributes to writing a new universe within the heart. I see more clearly than ever that every judgment of God carries within it the seed of hope. He breaks the rod of the oppressor, but at the same time unlocks the chains of the oppressed. He brings down the tower of pride, but allows humble shoots to sprout from the roots. The separations in Isaiah also become my own lesson. that to hear the true call, the soul must accept seasons of solitude, must dare to stand apart from the crowd in order to hear the echo from the depths. And when I ponder the acceleration in the divine plan, I understand that patience is never wasted, for when the season comes, the outburst will exceed expectation, and all the silent days are only foundations for the moment of exaltation. These resonances do not make me a dreamer escaping reality. Rather, they compel me to live more truly, more righteously, and more consciously in every small act. For if the new heaven and the new earth are written with every letter of righteousness, then I cannot take lightly any decision. I cannot pass over any chance to sow truth or mercy. Every choice today becomes a brick in the New Jerusalem. Every note, a part of the symphony that God is conducting, and in all of this, what remains deepest is the certainty that Emmanuel, God with us, is not a distant concept, but a near reality, the breath in every moment. I no longer see my life as a series of scattered events, but as part of a greater flow where God both judges and restores, both tests and comforts, and always keeps the holy seed within me from being extinguished. The crystallization of this awareness is a profound peace, not because every question has been answered, but because I know that in every darkest chapter there is still light, in every pain there is still a seed of life, and in every judgment there is still an echo of love. That echo will continue to follow me, reminding me to live as part of the remnant, to keep the flame, even if only as embers, because when the season comes, those very embers will ignite an entire new heaven and new earth within the soul